Hello and welcome to the third and final part of our analysis of iCAT04. iCAT4, as we said, is part of our All India National Level CAT test series for CAT 18. As we saw in the first two parts, iCAT4 has been classified as a moderate to tough mock with an average difficulty level per question at around 1.94. What this means is that if each question is mapped at an LOD of 1 to 3, where 1 stands for easy and 3 stands for tough, then the average difficulty per question was just below 2 or just below moderate. Just to give you a perspective, the difficulty level of CAT over the last 3 years has been mapped somewhere between 1.9 to 1.95. So in that sense, this was a mock which was more or less at par with CAT on the whole. Of course, a huge difference, as we saw in the first two sections, was that verbal was significantly tougher than what you expect in CAT, and DILR was reasonably simpler compared to what you expect in CAT. So those two sections counterbalanced each other. Here, when we see the quant section, you will observe that quant was classified as an easy to moderate section with an average difficulty of approximately 1.7. Again, to give you a perspective, in quant the difficulty level has been mapped somewhere between 1.6 to 1.65. So you can say that quant was marginally tougher compared to the actual exam. Now, before we go into the analysis of this mock's quant, we first need to look at the overall breakup of the quant section in the actual CAT. Sorry, health issues. So, in the CAT, the overall breakup of easy, moderate and difficult questions in quant is more or less fixed. We know that in CAT, there are anywhere between 15 to 17 easy questions, 3 to 5 tough questions, and the remaining 15 to 17 questions can be classified as moderate questions. So these moderate questions are essentially the gray area between easy and tough, where the same question can be classified as tough by some faculty or even as easy by some faculty based on their understanding of the question. This also takes into account the fact that every student would not be great at their understanding of those concepts. Now, considering the fact that students generally need to have at least 20 plus attempts in quant to clear the sectional cutoff, these moderate questions become extremely important, even assuming that a student has been able to solve all the easy questions in the exam and has smartly skipped the tough questions. Then here in moderate, it becomes important for the student to have diversified his or her base and attempted or mastered as many chapters as possible so as to increase his overall attempts. That becomes a very important point. Generally, we've seen that students claim that they are good at one or two areas, let's say like arithmetic and algebra. But then what happens if arithmetic and algebra turn out to be on the tougher side in your exam and geometry and modern math have more of the easier questions? Then what do? That is where you need to have a reasonably good working knowledge of all the chapters in quant. And considering that there's still about 25 days left for CAT, it is important that you still at least have some grasp over the basic concept of as many chapters as you can. Let's have a look at the overall section here. As you can see, here, quant is something that can be clearly divided into 4 areas: arithmetic, algebra, geometry and modern math. Now, students, as we said earlier, often say that they are good at one or two of these areas, but that does not mean that they are uniformly good or uniformly bad at these areas. Sometimes they do not realize that they are good at certain chapters within these areas, and hence if more questions come from the other chapters, they might actually struggle in even their strong points. So we need to break up the analysis into more detail. Let's do that here. So firstly, as we observe, quant had an average LOD of 1.7, which we saw earlier. As we can see from this graph, algebra was the section that the area that more or less represented the similar LOD. So it was marginally tougher compared to the overall section LOD. Similarly, geometry was marginally easier compared to the section LOD. So in that sense, algebra and geometry both counterbalanced each other. Now, when I see at the other two areas, I can clearly observe that arithmetic was absolutely simple with an average LOD just above 1, which means nearly every question in this particular part of the mock would have been easy. On the other hand, when I look at modern math, now obviously if algebra and geometry are going to counterbalance each other and arithmetic is extremely simple, there has to be one area which is extremely tough, and unsurprisingly it was modern math tending really towards tough. So this was by far a clear-cut breakup where you knew, even just looking at the LODs, that arithmetic followed by geometry here were the two areas that would have given you the maximum number of attempts. Let's now go into the sections into a little more detail. So firstly, let's look at the overall number of questions. There were 11 questions in arithmetic, which is more or less as per the trend that we've seen in CAT. 10 in algebra, which is slightly higher. Generally, there are 9 questions, which we've seen. Of course, this is no rule, so we can say more or less it was at par. Geometry had 5 questions, slightly lower than what we've come to expect. And modern math had 8 questions, slightly higher than what we've come to expect. Typically, what we've seen is that geometry and modern math is somewhere around the 7:6 ratio. So here that ratio really got inverted. Now when we go within each area, what we observe at the very beginning, look at arithmetic. Of the 11 questions, 7 questions are clear-cut sitters. Now what are sitters? Technically they are the same as easy questions, as both have LOD 1. But the sitters are those questions where the effort required to solve the question is minimal. So the concept involved is very simple. There's really no thinking. Plus with the calculator around, the calculations are easy. So these are questions where you'll understand the approach directly, and the time that you take will be so less that these questions can be done even within a minute or so. So these are the absolutely easy questions. So of these 11, we can see that there were 7 sitters and 3 easy questions. So 10 out of 11 questions were on the easier side, with just about 1 question being moderate. So in arithmetic, it was a clear-cut strategy that you had to try and attempt every single question, which means that you had to try and maximize your attempts. That was a very, very important aspect of this mock. So here, even if you were good or decent at arithmetic, it would have been a great thing for you, because you could have searched for these questions and solved as many as possible in order to clear the sectional cutoff. Let's similarly look at geometry. Now here, compared to arithmetic, though geometry was on the easier side, a drawback here was that the number of questions were half those of arithmetic. So there were hardly 5 questions compared to 11. Of these 5, only 2 were on the easier side, with 1 being a sitter and 1 being easy. There were 3 questions that were moderate. So here it would have been a case of selecting the right questions to attempt. Because typically the moderate to tough questions in geometry or modern math are the ones that are genuinely on the tougher side compared to something like arithmetic. Now when I look at algebra was more or less the most balanced area of this mock. So of the 10 questions, there were 4 easy questions, 4 moderate questions, and then 2 tough questions. So here again the key was to avoid the 2 tough questions. Try and maximize your attempts in the 4 easy questions and select the right questions to solve in the moderate ones. Now, when we say select the right questions to solve in the moderate ones, it also means that you need to be strong at multiple chapters because the moderate questions may have been from different chapters in algebra. So here the key part would be 1. Maximize your attempts in the easy questions and then select the right questions to solve in the moderate questions. Finally, moving to modern math, very clearly this was the toughest section with an average LOD of 2.5. Now why was that the case? Observe that 5 out of 8 questions were tough, not even moderate, tough. And then there were 2 questions that were moderate. So you contrast this with algebra where 10 out of 11 were easy. Here 7 out of 8 were moderate to tough. So while this became extremely easy, this became extremely tough. There was only one question that could be called easy, plus there was no sitter. So here it was really a case more of identifying those 1 or 2 questions that you could have solved. Broadly, if I look at the breakup of these sitters and easy questions, I can observe that there were 9 sitters and 8 easy questions. So on the whole, there were 17 easy questions as we had expected. The number of tough questions was 7, which was slightly higher compared to what we had expected. That is why the difficulty level went up a little compared to the standard difficulty level. And the number of moderate questions was 10, which was less than the number of questions that we expected. So the tough questions going up and the moderate questions going down increase the overall difficulty a bit. If we were to try and attempt even 15 questions here and maybe half of the moderate questions and potentially say one of the tough questions here and there based on your comfort level, it was easily possible to attempt anywhere around 21 questions in this section, but this depended a lot on attempting most of the easy questions. So this was dependent on the fact that you had to select the right questions to attempt. So for such a mock or such a section, question selection became an extremely important parameter. Having said that there were 9 sitters, let's have a look at some of these sitters. So our faculty have created this list of 9 sitters that they identified for this mock. So the question numbers and the chapter names are given to you. Now this is not an exhaustive list by any means, which means that when you sit down to make your own list, you can add or subtract more chapters based on your comfort level or add or subtract more questions. However, you need to look at each of these questions, see whether you attempted them or not. If you did not attempt them, please check whether you missed the question or did not attempt it because of some other reasons. If you attempted it, check whether you got it right or wrong. If you got it wrong, where did you go wrong? Because these are the kind of questions which will definitely give you a lot of marks. Let's look at the final graph of this analysis, which is a graph which we saw in all the 3 sections, which is the LODs of all questions from 67 to 100. As explained in verbal, the blue lines indicate the MCQs and the orange lines indicate the theta or any questions. We always keep saying that you will find chunks of easy or tough questions and that will tell you the areas where you could have either scored a lot of marks or stumbled. For instance, when I look at this particular graph, I know that there were 17 easy questions in the mock. But when I look at this graph, it gives me a lot more clarity because I can see areas where these easy questions were clustered together. For example, there are 4 easy questions. So there are 4 easy questions here, back to back. Similarly, right at the beginning, there are 2 sets of 3 easy questions. Then again, 2 sets of 2 easy questions together, and then one-off questions here. So even keeping aside these one-off questions or 2 sets of easy questions, these 3 big chunks are really questions that I can solve together. And considering that 4 out of these 10 here are numerical entry, my chances of losing marks also go down. At the same time, when I look at this chunk here from question 85 to 90, which is right at the beginning of the second half of the section, this is where I have maximum tough and moderate questions together. Similarly, this chunk here from 76 to 82, though it does have 2 easy questions, these are hidden between tough questions, so chances of you actually finding these questions and attempting them can go down if you are going strictly in chronological or sequential order. So here, as you can see in this mock, the tough and moderate questions are more or less evenly spread, but there are certain areas where these questions are clustered together. So when you analyze the mock, you need to look at these clusters and see whether your attempts went down because you got stuck at one of these clusters, or whether you missed out attempting these 4 questions at all, and so on. So for every mock, this sequence will change, but you need to look at this kind of a sequence and see whether you made the right attempt strategy or not. Let's have a look at 1 or 2 questions and see how they could have been attempted. Let's look at question 77, for instance. If A1, A2, A3 are in AP and AP, AQ, AR are in GP, then AQ upon AP is what? Now, this can be done using the standard formulae for AP-GP, where you say A2 equal to A1 plus B and AQ upon AP equal to R and all of that. However, these kind of questions can be done much faster and in a much simpler way using actual numbers. So there are 2 ways to solve such a question. Let's say I take AP, AQ, AR as 1, 2, 4 and so on, and A1, A2, A3 as 1, 2, 3 and so on, and then I can straight away correspond the 2 values and compare the 2. An even easier way is to note that if all the terms of a sequence are the same, then that sequence is an AP as well as a GP as well as an HP. So for instance, here there is no rule that says that the values have to be distinct or they have to satisfy some condition. So suppose I take all the values as 1, then AQ upon AP is going to be equal to 1, which means that my AQ upon AP is going to be AR upon AQ equal to 1. Also my AP will be 1 or P will be 1 because that's the first term. Q will be 2 and R will be 3. So my ratio is 1. I just need to substitute these 3 values here and get my answer. Now if this is 1, these 2 cannot be my answers. If I substitute this, r minus p is 2, q minus p is 1, so that cannot be my answer. R minus q is 1 upon q minus p is 1. 1 divided by 1 is equal to 1. Hence, this is my answer. So it does not really require any algebra. This is more of common sense and an understanding of the properties of APG. So very often you need to know the basic properties, but after that what you require is presence of mind in order to solve certain questions faster. On the whole, if we were to look at this entire section, we can say that it was an easy to moderate section in a moderate to tough mock. Anywhere close to 20 to 21 attempts would be a good performance. If we were to summarize the whole mock, we can say that this mock was characterized by a tough VA section with 13 questions, a moderate DILR section with 20 good attempts, and an easy to moderate quant section with 21 good attempts. So overall, if we were to calculate the number of good attempts for this mock, we can say anywhere close to 54 to 55 attempts would be a good performance. This completes the analysis for iCAT04. The analysis for all our previous mocks are available on our official YouTube channel, which is given in the link here. You can subscribe to our channel by clicking the link given. To get notifications every time a new video is put up, just hit the bell button. Please feel free to put in your comments, feedback or questions in the thread below the video. Keep watching. Thank you and wish you all the very best.